Welcome to our program tonight. My name is Ross Jordan. I'm the curatorial manager at the Jane Addams Hull-House Museum. Jane Addams Hull-House Museum is located on the campus of the University of Illinois, Chicago, and draws upon the legacy of international peace activists, suffragist and feminist Jane Addams, and other social reformers who lived and worked alongside their immigrant neighbors to expand democracy on the near west side of Chicago. The museum connects the history of Hull-House settlement to present-day social justice issues. Today's program is a continuation of our Race and Women's Suffrage Centennial series titled With You or Not at All, in partnership with the Frances Willard House Museum and Northwestern University's Department of History. The program series title, With You or Not at All, is an excerpt of a quote from journalist and anti-lynching activist and Black suffragist Ida B. Wells, when she refused to march in a suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. She demanded to walk alongside white suffragist delegates from Illinois, or she would not march at all. This program tonight also supports the museum's current exhibitions that commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The exhibition, Why Women Should Vote, titled after the 1910 essay by Jane Addams, traces women's voter education in Illinois and highlights Ida B. Wells and the history of racism in the suffrage movement. True Peace, the Presence of Justice, titled after a phrase often attributed to Jane Addams, juxtaposes the international peace and human rights efforts and activism led by women opposed to World War I, with present-day challenges to policing and prisons, campaigns often led by women of color and communities and queer communities of color. You can visit both these exhibitions virtually on our website at hullhousemuseum.org. Many of you are joining us from communities and libraries across Illinois. During a historic pandemic, an historic election, and continued calls for social justice, libraries have continued to find ways to serve everyday folks like you and I, and their partnership has made this virtual program tonight and our virtual exhibitions at the museum accessible to the public. We welcome and we thank our library partners reaching across Illinois library systems, Aurora Public Library, Gil Borden Public Library, Arlington Heights Memorial Library, and Schaumburg Township District Library. This program tonight is also supported by the Terra Foundation for American Art. Tonight we will hear from Martha Jones, the author of the just released Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted Upon Equality for All. Afterward, Dr. Jones will be joined and led in conversation by Dr. Leslie Harris, Professor of History at Northwestern University. We'll also have a chance to ask questions near the end, and be aware that folks are joining us from lots of different Facebook pages, so we won't be able to see or answer all your questions, but we'll gather them up and do our best to get to them on our social media in the future. Professor Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the history of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Birthright Citizen, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, the winner of a number of awards, including the Organization for American Historians Liberty Legacy Award for the best book on civil rights history. She's also the author of All Bound Up Together, The Women Question in African-American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and a co-editor of the Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women. Currently, she is at work on a biography of the US Supreme Court Justice Roger Brooke Taney. As a public historian, Professor Jones' writing has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, The Chronicle of Education, and Time Magazine. Her writing and thinking has contributed to museum exhibitions, including Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation in conjunction with the William L. Clements Library. Other museum, film, and video productions include the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, and you likely saw her appear alongside the programming for PBS's American Experience program two-part series, The Vote. Professor Jones currently serves as the president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians. Please welcome Professor Martha S. Jones.
Good evening. Thanks very much to Ross Jordan for the kind introduction. And thank you to Jane Addams Hull-House, UIC, Northwestern University, and the Francis Willard House for bringing us together tonight for a conversation that I'm really looking forward to with the distinguished historian, Professor Leslie Harris. Let me dive in, and I thought I'd spend a few minutes just introducing Vanguard to those of you, certainly those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read it, and then we'll have a chance to introduce and bring Professor Harris on board for a conversation that I'm really looking forward to. One of the questions that I've been often asked is, how did I come to write this book? Why this book? Why now? And it's important not to be coy. I knew that we were heading toward the 100th anniversary celebration of the 19th Amendment, 1920 to 2020. And some of the early stirrings about how this commemoration year would unfold led me to be frankly concerned that African American women's history, their contributions, their commitment to suffrage and political rights more generally might be muted in the year 2020. I had seen some preliminary proposals for monuments that would mark this centennial year, and African American women were at least initially absent. And this really led me to think that perhaps it was time for us to have a book that pulled together 200 years of African American women's political history. It is a book that builds on 3 generations of Black women's historians and their formidable work in the archives of our national past. And Vanguard is an effort to bring that together, to bring the stories of some women who will be well known to you and others that I hope are new to readers, but really looking to ensure that African American women had the place that they warranted in a centennial year like this one. One of the things that I was interested in was challenging some of the myths that oftentimes attend commemorations, and the 19th Amendment has been no exception to the distance or the trouble between myths and history. Commemorations are that kind of occasion. And so it's been an opportunity to talk some about what I think are 2 principal myths about this amendment. The first is that in 1920, American women, all American women, won the right to vote. We hear even the notion that this was an amendment that guaranteed American women the right to vote. The second myth is one that almost runs directly counter to the first, and it is the notion that no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept all Black women away from the polls. And having posed these as myths, I can say a little bit about how I hope Vanguard speaks to those myths and replaces them to an important degree with the history that we've come to know. The first is that, of course, the 19th Amendment guarantees to no American woman the right to vote. Nothing in our Constitution guarantees any American the right to vote. The 19th Amendment does something very particular, and that is to prohibit both the federal government and the individual states from using sex as a criteria from voting rights. But this doesn't mean that there aren't many American women who aren't still kept from the polls. Women continue to be kept from the polls by virtue of age, by virtue of residency, by virtue of citizenship. In 1920, it's still true that American women who marry non-citizens lose their citizenship and their eligibility to vote. Women are kept from the polls by tests and standards of so-called mental competence. So there are many American women who are not able to vote after 1920, despite the winning of a federal amendment to the Constitution. But let's turn to African American women. And the first thing it's important to point out, and here we are hosted by folks in the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois who know very well that in Illinois, as well as in California and New York, importantly, in these states and others, American women are voting even before a federal amendment, and that includes Black American women who are already at the polls, who are already inserting themselves into party politics and are beginning to strategize about how to use this newly won political power, power that has come to them by virtue of the actions of state authorities rather than federal authorities, how to use those to affect the interests of their families and the interests of their communities. So Black women in some important places are already voting before 1920. But do all Black American women vote after the 19th Amendment? The answer is no. That the open secret that accompanies the road to the ratification of the 19th Amendment is that nothing in the amendment's language guarantees to any American, any woman the right to vote, but more importantly, nothing in the 19th Amendment interferes with the right, the capacity, the authority of individual states to use their laws to continue now to keep Black American women away from the polls, much as the way Black American men had already been disenfranchised, especially in the American South. So nothing in the 19th Amendment, it is acknowledged, and in fact, it is fundamental to its ratification. Nothing in the 19th Amendment interferes with poll taxes or literacy tests or understanding clauses or whites-only primaries. Nothing in the 19th Amendment curbs intimidation and violence, which also contributes to the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. So African American women arrive at this moment in 1920, and it is without question a landmark, but it is an incomplete moment precisely because state laws are going to keep too many of them from the polls. And when Black women convene, as they do through organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, they are going to look forward to what is next and recognize that before they are going to get to the polls, they are going to need federal legislation that gives teeth to the 15th Amendment that had prohibited the states from using race, and now the 19th Amendment that prohibits the states from using sex. These amendments need teeth in the form of federal legislation, and what 1920 really marks for African American women is, you could say, the beginning of a new movement for voting rights, one that they will wage alongside African American men, campaigns that will happen in courtrooms, that will happen in Southern communities, that will happen at the grassroots, as well as in Congress. That is a struggle that begins in 1920 for African American women and takes them all the way until 1965 and the ratification, the passage in that year of the Voting Rights Act. Now, one of the things I hope for this book is that while it would revisit some old characters. It will also introduce you to some new characters in the history of women's struggles for the vote. So I'll mention very briefly just one, Hallie Quinn Brown. If she's not a household name today, I aim to make her one. And I do so by telling a story about how she comes of age, first as a teacher and an educator, then as a woman activist in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And by the late 19th century, she is part of the National Association of Colored Women, heading its suffrage department. Hallie Quinn Brown in 1920 is now been elected president of the NACW, and she sets her sights on winning federal legislation. And in order to do so, she needs a strategy, and one approach she considers is perhaps aligning Black women now with the white women who had headed the National Women's Party, who had headed the National Americans Women's Suffrage Association. And she calls on Alice Paul, who's leading the National Women's Party in the winter of 1921, to request, to ask, to urge Paul to join forces with African American women to press forward on the quest for women's full suffrage and to work toward federal legislation. Hallie Quinn Brown knows that Alice Paul is an astute and highly effective political operative. Her work toward the 19th Amendment has proven that. But the end of this chapter in Vanguard is one in which we know the National Women's Party that winter will fold up shop. Alice Paul will decline to join with Hallie Quinn Brown in the National Association of Colored Women, and will go on to champion another great cause, that of the Equal Rights Amendment. But this sets the stage for African American women to write the next chapter in the history of voting rights. And Vanguard will follow figures like Hallie Quinn Brown and the other women of the National Association of Colored Women all the way until 1965 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The last thing I'll say is that this was very much a book written to help us all be, if you will, more literate about not only who the Black women political leaders are here in 2020, but who they come from, and the traditions, the inspirations, the sheroes, and more that undergird the force that African American women increasingly exercise in our political culture today. Now, many women might come to mind, but I'll point to perhaps the most obvious, and that is Senator Kamala Harris, who today, as we know, is the Democratic Party's nominee for the vice presidency. During her acceptance speech just a few weeks ago during the Democratic convention, Senator Harris unwittingly did me a big favor. She name-checked the African American women on whose shoulders, she explained, we all stand. And indeed, they are the women that the story of Vanguard recounts. Mary Church Terrell and Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer and Diane Nash, Shirley Chisholm and Constance Baker Motley. When Kamala Harris invoked those women, my heart sang because I suspected that the political tradition that she would invoke, the history that she would point us to in order for us to understand the significance and the possibility of her rise to political power was not a history that could be told simply through stories and histories of Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt or Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony. So I hope that those of you who have a chance to read Vanguard will, like me, become deeply enthralled with this other story of women's suffrage and women's rights in the United States, one that begins 200 years ago and continues today through the force of African American women in politics in 2020. So thank you. And I think with that, I get to perhaps welcome back Ross Jordan, who I think is going to introduce Dr. Harris. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you, Martha, for that. That was absolutely lovely. And I things like legacy and inspiration, I think, are really important right now when it comes to voting and we think about voting rights. So I'm happy you raised those two words up at this moment. If you're out in the audience, you have questions, please use the Q&A function to bring those in, also on Facebook as well. But right now, I am going to bring in Professor Leslie Harris. Leslie Harris is professor of history at Northwestern University, is the author and co-editor of 3 award-winning books. Get your pens out to write these down. In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York, 1626 to 1863. She's also the co-editor of Slavery in New York, which accompanied the groundbreaking New York Historical Society exhibition of the same name. The last book is Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, co-edited with Diane Ramey Berry in collaboration with the Telfair Museum's Owens Thomas House. From 2004 to 2011, Professor Harris co-founded and co-directed the Transforming Community Project at Emory University, which used history to engage members of the university community in dialogue, research, and teaching on racial and other forms of human diversity. In 2011, the Transforming Community Project organized the first international conference on history of slavery in higher education. Harris also recently completed Slavery and Sexuality, Reclaiming Intimate Histories in the Americas, also with Diane Ramey Berry. And recently, Slavery and the University, Histories of Legacies, which included Thomas T. Campbell and Alfred L. Brophy. As a 2020-2001 Beatrice Shepard Blaine Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, she will complete work on a book in late 20th century New Orleans entitled Leaving New Orleans, a personal urban history. And of course, New Orleans is on our mind right now very much. So Leslie Harris, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ross, for that wonderful introduction. And Martha, it's such a pleasure to have you here. And I'm so thrilled with your book. I want to congratulate you on what's really a stunning achievement. You bring so many people together. And although today you focus on the 20th century part, I want to let our audience know that this book begins really in the early 1800s with Maria Stewart as one of many pre-Civil War figures who are working to find a way to elevate their own voice on behalf of Black people. Jarena Lee, a spiritual figure, religious figure. And this book has such a sweep, and the history is told through the lives of these amazing women. Some we've heard of before and some we haven't. And it's just a pleasure to read. So if you haven't already gotten your copy, I'm gonna say get a copy. It's a really wonderful way also to experience US history as a book by a friend of ours, Black Women's History as US History. This is yet another example of what happens when we view US history or women's history through the eyes of Black people, and in this case, through the eyes of Black women. So Martha, this is a beautiful book. It's beautifully written. I learned so much. And so I just want to congratulate you first and foremost for this amazing book and for getting it done in record time. I have no idea how you did it. We'll talk afterwards about that. I was going to start in a different place, but your opening really surprised me. It's always good to have a lawyer, thank you, to tell us just where we are and where we aren't protected. And maybe many of you in the audience also was sort of surprised to hear the limits on the 19th Amendment, the limits in terms of our suffrage rights and what is protected. And so I was going to talk about that more towards the end, but I think I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. And what came to mind as you were describing the ways in which the 19th Amendment really didn't contribute to, it was only a small step, I guess I'll say, for Black women as voters. And I guess I want to ask you, how should we think about then this 100-year anniversary, really? Is this something that Black women can honor? What was the role of Black women? Part of your, a large part of your book is about the fact that Black women do contribute to the 19th Amendment, to the struggle for suffrage at that moment, and that it is an achievement. Is this a holiday? Is this an anniversary, excuse me, that we can look back on and claim? If you could speak to that, I would really appreciate that.
Sure. I'm someone who has come out to say the 19th Amendment anniversary is not an occasion that I am celebrating. Now, the good news is for folks who do want to celebrate, I'm a historian. I don't plan celebrations. There have been lots of wonderful and exuberant occasions that have accompanied this anniversary. But I say that precisely for the reasons that you allude to, that the road to the 19th Amendment is to such a significant degree paved with complicity, with accommodation to, and at the end, even premised in the ongoing disenfranchisement of African American women, that for someone like me, it is not an occasion for celebration. It is a landmark in a long national narrative around the history of voting rights, but it is hardly a moment that is taking us on some untroubled upward trajectory toward ever expanding access to the ballot in this country. Now, some of you may know Tennessee is the 36th state that ratifies the 19th Amendment. Historian Elaine Weiss has told that story vividly in her book, The Woman's Hour. But what Elaine tells us and what we know is that Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment is openly and expressly premised upon the understanding that nothing in this amendment will interfere with the state's intention, which is to disenfranchise many, many Black women voters, even after a federal amendment. And given where we sit today, in a moment of, another moment of national reckoning, of national confrontation with the tragic degree to which racism has persisted and shaped all aspects of American life, it is hard not to recognize that the 19th Amendment is complicit in that, the possibility that anti-Black racism will become and remain further entrenched in American law and in American politics. If there's something to celebrate, and I think there are things to celebrate, and I think you were trying to make sure we get to that, right? That Black women are incredibly courageous, right? They face now the kind of violence that had long visited African American men when they attempted to register the polls, and some of them, stare down, the Ku Klux Klan in all of its, exaggerated form. There are Black women who are going to organize in suffrage schools to teach one another how to pass literacy tests and pay poll taxes and overcome the hurdles that state officials are going to put in their way. And this tradition, right, of Black Americans seizing something like a constitutional amendment and doing the work on the ground to breathe life into it, to breathe meaning into it, to hold it up, right, to its highest ideals, is certainly a history and a political tradition worth honoring and even celebrating. But the amendment itself, I think, papers over too much that is difficult in the early 20th century to quite be something that we celebrate.
One of the things that your book does really well, and this is both a comment but then a question, is you talk about not only the struggle for the vote, which is of course very important, but I think your book also, again, starting in 1800, shows that the emphasis on the vote grows over time. So when you're starting in 1800 with someone like Maria Stewart or Jarena Lee, they have a very different, I think, set of concerns. And, you know, this is an early time when not everyone votes anyway. I mean, a lot of people still have property requirements for voting, right? And so their struggle is as much to have a voice in public, to encourage their own communities, to participate in political activism and influence in a different kind of way. And I see that, you know, the vote throughout your book becomes more and more important to these communities. Of course, the 19th Amendment, of course, the 15th Amendment, and certainly the 65 Voting Rights Act. But there are other ways in which women in particular, Black women in particular, but Black people in general, have historical activism. My question is, how today do you think that we should think about the vote? There are a lot of people who I think are you know, active politically and yet disaffected a little bit by the vote, by the results of electoral politics. Where does the vote for your women, for the women that you talk about, where does the vote sit in terms of their activism as a whole? And why do they struggle so hard for it? I think that's an important, why, you know, why does it become so important?
Yeah, sure. You know, I had an experience back in June in I live in Maryland, and we had a primary contest in early June, and it was mostly vote by mail, but not everyone in Baltimore, where I live, got their ballots. And so they opened up polling places quite at the last moment. And of course, we were already by then well into the challenges of the coronavirus. And I watched Black Americans in my city, despite that, line up at those polling places, social distance, waiting for some of the many hours in order to cast ballots. And that was a reminder to me that the vote still does matter. It matters enough that we come out, some of us come out even despite, you know, the conditions of the pandemic. But those were also the weeks of some really in my city, nearly every day, protests led by the Movement for Black Lives. And it occurred to me that perhaps in the African-American political tradition, these are part of a whole, right? That these aren't either or propositions, even as individuals will chart their own way. And I think that is an inherited tradition, because the women I write about, as you suggest, are never wholly fixed on voting rights as a panacea or a solution, or even the highest form of political engagement. And across the long swath of this book, we see the ways in which Black women are organizers, and they are lobbyists, and they are engaged in protest. They are writers, they are journalists. And all of these things are part of a necessarily varied political arsenal for a community of people who for a very long time are deprived of the vote. And at the same time, your question was in part, you know, why does the vote, or how does the vote come to loom so large? I think it is partly in the story of having been deprived of it, right? That, you know, I don't remember who says it, that, you know, if perhaps it's Stacey Abrams, I think, who says, you know, if they're keeping us from the poll, there must be something going on there, right? That's pretty powerful, because my goodness, right? This country organizes for a very long time to keep us from casting ballots. And there's no question that the story of women in 1920, there's no, Black women aren't kept from the polls out of some raw racial animus, though that exists. They're kept from the polls because what white Democrats know is that if Black women get to the polls, they will vote Republican in a block. and they will shift the balance of political power, especially in localities, especially at the state level. And so, so yes, we're kept from the polls because it turns out that coming to the polls, using our vote strategically, collectively, does begin to move the needle in American politics. And we see lots of evidence for that here in the 21st century. So for me, this is part of the political tradition. And recently, I've been reading a beautiful set of interviews done by the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, interviews with formerly incarcerated people whose voting rights have been restored. And they, of all colors and backgrounds, who tell a story not unlike the stories that Black Americans tell about how profoundly meaningful, transformative it is to finally win one's voting rights and cast those ballots. And so I think these are in some ways companion stories. Immigrant Americans will oftentimes also tell those stories of the long road to, say, from refugee status to citizen status, and how then the vote and its significance is heightened. And so I actually think in this country, it is people who have the experience, the memory of not voting, who more than anyone else hold up, revere, and remind all Americans what a privilege it is to cast a ballot. And Black Americans still have the living memory of disenfranchisement in our own lives, in our own families. And I think we bequeath that sensibility about the vote to the whole nation.
I love that you are now talking about individual stories about the vote, because one of the things at the very beginning of your book that you talk about first is your own family story of voting, like what voting meant for women, but for everyone in your family, particularly in the years during and after the Civil War. And it made me think, do I have a story? Do I even know if I have a family story about voting? How would I find it? And what if we, each of us, went back and talked to parents, grandparents, family historians, you know, the aunt who knows everything about the family, to find out what the story of family voting is in families. You wrote very movingly about several generations of women in your family who struggled as part of voting rights activism and didn't always achieve it in their own lifetimes. The other thing I want to say in your family history is that was it Greensboro, North Carolina? Is it your great-great-grandfather, I think, who was, had registered to vote in the years after the Civil War? And in the newspaper, they listed all the Black men who had registered to vote. And I think this is important because it indicates why some of us are skeptical about whether or not we'll be treated fairly at the polls, because, and I had not really heard of this tactic, but they printed everyone's name. They said, these are the colored men, I think they said, or something, who have registered to vote. You who are in these districts, registrars, etc., make note. Do not challenge them until election day. And then when they show up at the polls, challenge them. And I thought, wow. So if you challenge them earlier, they might go to court and get the proper piece of paper.
Exactly.
You challenge them on election day, they will not be able to do anything and they will not vote. And that, you know, really, I just shook my head. I thought, this is why we have poll watchers. This is why we need people there. This is, you know, such a long history of really trying to strip the vote from people who had just earned it. Yeah. And I'll say one more thing about that time period, of course, which you also know, is that Black voting during that time period, I think it is still the time period in which there were more Black office holders at every level. We have still not achieved that in terms of numbers, from sheriffs who were voted in all the way up to Congress. And that was the power of voting. immediately after slavery. People, as soon as they gained freedom and then gained the right to vote, they were going to go and vote.
You know, I was stunned to find this. It's a flyer that I think circulated among white Democrats that named every Black man in Guilford County, North Carolina by name, 400 of them. And you're absolutely right. It is the instrument, right, of voter suppression. That's what we would call it today. It is intimidation. It is violence. And by 1920 in Greensboro, another notorious flyer circulates, this one targeting Black women, challenging the leader of the state Black women's clubs in North Carolina, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, in a fabricated flyer circulates that wins her the ire of white Democrats who intimidate her and buy her all Black women when it comes to the fall of 1920 and the prospect that they might vote. She's regarded as having committed heresy for allegedly circulating a flyer that encouraged Black women to register and vote. And I like to say, and this in North Carolina, which is oftentimes regarded, you know, as somehow not quite as Southern a state as other states. That's certainly part of the lore I was raised with. Wow. But I really appreciate, you know, the question and our questioning our own families about the history of voting rights, because I didn't know these stories before I began Vanguard. And I never told my editor I was taking a detour to look at my own family, but I felt, you know, I write with the women in my family on the wall here in my office, and I feel accountable to them. And I thought it was time to try and, as best I could, recover that story. And as you know, I can't recover everything, that the records haven't survived about a great deal of that era of disfranchisement of Black women in the 1920s. But I was able to recover enough to recognize that voting rights mattered to them, not only to the women in my family in 1920. My great-grandmother was a suffragist in St. Louis, Missouri, and ran a suffrage school in a YWCA there. But her daughter, when her daughter later speaks about voting rights, she talks about the 1950s and 60s and the modern civil rights era and getting out the vote, getting Black Americans in Greensboro registered and voting in the heart of the modern civil rights era. And that was a reminder to me of why this book had to come all the way to 1965. I would have missed my grandmother's story, as she pulls it. It was thrilling, is the way she put it. And it is thrilling and dangerous and profound, what the struggles that Black Americans engage in still, right? Almost 100 years after the 15th Amendment. But I was very fortunate to be able to find that story and be able to retell it.
Yeah, it's beautifully done. I want to move us a little bit away from voting, because another big theme in your book, which is, this isn't unrelated to voting, but is the role of religion. And you said you had to get to 1965, but you go past 1965. And for those who are interested, the book, I think in the final chapter, goes into the 70s, into, I think, maybe even the early 80s.
I come all the way to Stacey Abrams.
And then I was going to say the epilogue comes right to Stacey Abrams. So this is a cover to cover. I mean, this is everything up to today, practically. So very informative in that way. But one of the themes that I was surprised, I guess, to see in a way is how religion works, how churches are a training ground. And you really, again, starting with Jarena Lee and Mariah Stewart, these early 19th century women who are struggling within church structures or using religion to say, we deserve to be able to speak in public. Jarena Lee is moved by the Spirit, as are many religious Black women who struggle for decades, if not over centuries, really. And I guess some may still be struggling today to have leadership in Black churches. This is true in many churches, of course, not just Black churches, but for this in Black churches. These are women who are literally helping to build the church in terms of providing money and other resources. And as one says in the late 19th century, no taxation without representation. Why are you not letting us be leaders, become deacons and ministers in these churches? And you start with the Jarena Lee, Mariah Stewart, who is more of a secular speaker. She's the first woman in America to speak, I think, before a political audience that is of men and women. These are called promiscuous audiences in the 19th century. But you also end with, and she brings in a lot of biblical imagery, a lot of understanding of women from the biblical era who were leaders, were politicians in power themselves. But you also end with Polly Murray, who's first Black woman to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. And that sweep, and also there's a very different meaning of religion for Polly Murray versus Mariah Stewart. And so I wanted to lift that theme up, and how do we think about these women's, both their spirituality, which is not necessarily the same thing as their organized church roles. They're in more struggle with the church, and how does that feed into political activism?
You know, part of what I was doing that takes me all the way back to Jarena Lee in the first decades of the 19th century is I'm looking for the roots of some very particular ideas that animate Black women's politics. I'm really looking for the roots of the critique that says no racism, no sexism, right? Neither of those are legitimate arbitrators of political power and more. So I am looking for that, and Jarena Lee not only leaves a remarkable record of lived experience, she pens a memoir in 1836 and recounts this story. And she, along with Mariah Stewart and Sarah Mapps Douglas, opened this book because they are among, for me, the women who are really the originators of this political critique. Right before even one can be an activist, one needs an idea. One needs an idea, and these are women who are in many ways singular in their contributions to this story, but are also fueling a set of ideas that will take strong hold by the time we get to the years after the Civil War, will be fully articulated by women like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the poet and anti-slavery activist, or Anna Julia Cooper, right? Those women will give full throat to these ideas of full-blown political philosophy that Black women work by and through. But I wanted to come back to these originators. And what's remarkable for me is that I hope I'm able to really toggle between the sacred and the secular to show the ways in which women and these ideas move between these realms, not seamlessly, but importantly. And so by the time we get to the 1870s, you know, Black women like Mary Ann Shadd Carrier in Washington, D.C., entreating Congress to render the district's voting laws gender neutral. Remove the word man and male from the law is what she says in the secular realm. And in the AME Zion Church, women are saying precisely the same thing. Let's scrutinize our church law and purge the word man and male. Now, the women in the church have more success than Mary Ann Shadd Carey in the 1870s, and that's part of the story. And their ideas will, by the end of the century, fuel and animate an organization like the National Association of Colored Women as Black women come out of churches or build secular spaces alongside their church spaces to get some of their political work done. So for me, when I Pauli Murray is a extraordinary character, one I could only speak about in small bits. There are others who have done, full biographical treatments of her remarkable life. But when she's ordained in the Episcopal Church and she becomes another first, well, she's not that interested in being a first, but she talks about the history. She knows the 200-year-long story of how Black Americans, including Black women, have been kept away from power in this church. She knows about the era of Jarena Lee, if she didn't know Lee herself. And so this, to me, affirms the sense that I develop as I'm writing Vanguard, that part of why this history matters and should matter to us is because it absolutely informs and undergirds, inspires, and guides women even in our own time, including Senator Harris, who I mentioned, as Black women come into politics, even in the 21st century. So Pauli Murray helps us appreciate that is an enduring, and for Murray, there is no conflict between her history around political rights and civil rights and her aspirations in the church. These are all part of a whole, is part of what I think is very moving about her story. A woman who had many, many lives in one lifetime, and struggled oftentimes to reconcile and fit them together. And remarkably, it's there in a church that's just beginning to ordain women that she finds, I think, arguably her best and most complete home. And I think Jarena Lee would have said the same.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I have to read this quote that you use from Pauli Murray, where she describes her faith in God, and she says, "In God there is no north or south, no black or white, no male or female, only the spirit of love and reconciliation, drawing us all toward the soul of human wholeness." And I just thought, oh, it's an astounding statement within the context of the Episcopal Church, which among Protestant churches is high church, as they say. But the way you described it, it is very much in line with what Mariah Stewart and Jarena Lee are also moving towards. And all of these women who are saying, why are you using my identity as a woman, gender, as the dividing thing, that we are people, we have much to give, and you're not allowing that to happen. So I think I have time for maybe one more question, but I also want to encourage people who can to contribute questions to the Q&A. Let me just see if I can one. Since we're in Chicago, can you talk a little bit about Chicago and Illinois during the suffrage era and maybe afterwards? There's this incredible story. I'm not sure how many people who are listening know about the role of Black women in Chicago, their use of the ballot before the 19th Amendment, and maybe there's more after the 19th Amendment as well that they were able to do here that they were not able to do in some other places. But take that wherever you want to take it.
I think one of the stories that's often told about Black women and the vote in Chicago is one that emerges out of the Alpha Suffrage Club, founded importantly by Ida B. Wells there, and the ways in which through that club and their increasing enmeshment in the Republican Party, African-American women are able to tip the scale and get Oscar DePriest elected to Congress in 1928. And I just had the chance to do a wonderful event with historian Lisa Matterson, who has written so importantly on this subject. But I became fascinated not by DePriest, but by his wife, Jessie DePriest, who accompanies her husband to Washington after his election. And we learn through her experience that not only he is a disruptive and provocative presence in Washington, but that she also is quite a disconcerting presence for people like Mrs. Hoover, who is responsible for organizing the social life of wives who have come to Washington. And Jessie DePriest is at the center of a brouhaha about whether or not she will indeed be invited to the White House for a tea. And there is a great deal of angst and strategizing before she is ultimately invited and successfully attends one of the First Lady's teas. But what comes after was most interesting to me is that she comes back to Chicago, as the DePriest do, and she speaks to the Black women in her community about many things, including the experience with this tea. You know, and she's really untroubled when she takes the podium by the whole event. She basically says, you know, those women, for all of the fuss, they're not very different from you and me, which is to say, right, we made, you know, polite, respectable women's chit chat. There was tea. It was not particularly exceptional. And it was a window, right, into the ways in which women like Jessie DePriest and many others in Chicago have a lot of experience with white women, sometimes as allies and many times in the grips of strife. And so to wind up in Washington and be at the center, you know, of a dust up and having to endure a tea, which certainly must have had its awkward moments, really doesn't overly trouble Jessie DePriest. And I think that's something we can say about the work that Black women did, particularly in Republican Party politics. This is part of what they earned. It's not an indifference to racism, no, but a capacity to do the work despite it, to you know, let it on some days roll off your back rather than, you know, go to your heart and soul. And so I really loved that scene of how she recounts the trouble in the White House and says to the women in Chicago, don't worry about that too much. I've got that, right? And we've got work to do, right? And so let's get back to our work.
Especially because this is on the eve or at the very beginning of the Great Depression. I mean, you know, tea in the White House is practically irrelevant at this point.
Absolutely.
You know, there really are other things that need to be handled. So, yeah. Let me check in and see if we have any questions coming through. Lori?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
I think I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions that we got on Facebook is actually, what was the role of class in the suffrage movement? It probably changes over time, Martha, dramatically, depending on when you're talking, but maybe cover that as you are able to in the different time periods that your book covers, which is a long story. So yeah, that came up on Facebook, and I'll keep an eye on any. Please put up those questions. We'd be happy to answer anything you're wondering.
Well, thanks to our friends on Facebook for tuning in this evening, and thank you for that important question. You know, I think there's no question but that class and many guises of class not only lurk, it really is oftentimes at the center and animating women's suffrage politics. If we go, for example, to a defining moment like the late 1860s, when we have an old coalition of women's rights advocates and abolitionists coming back together to debate at least their position on the future of voting rights. You'll remember perhaps that Elizabeth Cady Stanton will come forward as an advocate of the educated suffrage, the educated suffrage. And this is an express invocation of privilege that she would have white middle-class women enjoy in the political sphere, even if that comes at the expense of Black Americans, whom she quite wrongly but powerfully assumes are all formerly enslaved people, are all people without education and without the kind of class sensibilities that she privileges. So from very early on in this movement, class is very much in play. But it's also the case that by the time we come to the early 20th century, when the movement is gaining an important momentum, both increasingly at the state level and then in the interest of a federal amendment, we will have organized working women who will also be part of the movement and look to, through labor organizations, for example, shape not only the outcome of the movement, but shape the ideas and the rhetoric that undergirds the call for women's votes. Working women who are looking both to increase their political power in abstract sense, but are very concerned about issues related to working conditions and wages and more. So there are, if you will, corporatized working women who are a part of this scene. For African American women, there's no question but that the leadership in an organization like the National Association of Colored Women is grossly dominated by women who have become middle class. That's important to say, that the first generation of leaders, many of them themselves are born enslaved, or the children of enslaved people born in the years immediately following the Civil War. So partly when we look at an organization like the NACW, we see the ways in which some women are transforming, if you will, their status, their class, and their standing in these critical years after Reconstruction. But by the eve of the Civil War, the membership in the National Association of Colored Women is estimated to have been 300,000 women. And that, I think, that number alone tells a different story about who the rank and file women are in this organization. These are not simply privileged elite middle-class women of leisure at all. Most of the women, even in the leadership of the NACW, are working women, though they are working women as teachers, as social workers and the like, rather than as domestics or laborers. So I think that there still is history, I think, to be written about the full texture of an organization like the NACW. But there's no question that its philosophy, its ideology is one that the motto is lifting as we climb. And that tells us a great deal about the notion that there is a social hierarchy, and that there are Black women poised to lift up, if you will, others who occupy some lower rung. And that is a trouble for the NACW. I'd mention only then, the Black Women's National Baptist Convention, because there is an organization of not 300,000, of 3 million women, led by figures like Nannie Helen Burroughs. And Burroughs is adamant that she and her organization speak on behalf of working class Black women. And when she comes to the table, whether it's around suffrage or civil rights, Burroughs is a very different sort of figure in her emphasis and in the constituency out of which she emerges in this same moment, appear in many ways to someone like Ida Wells or Mary Church Terrell, but speaking a different language and a different set of values on some days that very much come out of her own personal history, but more importantly, the women who she represents, 3 million of them in the Black Baptist Church.
Yeah. We've got another question, a couple that are related, about some of the restrictions that were placed on people, like literacy tests, and how those restrictions look today with the Voting Rights Act and the changes, so bring it forward maybe to the present.
Absolutely. One of the things that the story of the 19th Amendment helps us see is that most of our history as a nation is characterized as much by voter suppression as it is by voting rights. And what's important, I think, to recognize about literacy tests and poll taxes, understanding clauses, grandfather clauses, those instruments that keep Black Americans from the polls, is that by and large, they are neutral on their face. They don't say Black people can't vote. They don't say Black women can't vote. But we know they are designed to, in effect, keep Black Americans from the polls. We know they are designed to do an end run around constitutional prescriptions, but are deployed and imposed in ways that vastly disproportionately keep Black Americans from the polls. Fast forward, if you will, to 2020, in the wake of the 2013 gutting of the Voting Rights Act in the Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder, now we have the resurgence, once again, of facially neutral restrictions on ballot access, voter ID requirements, the shuttering of polling places, the purging of voter rolls. It's incumbent upon us, right, to scratch the surface on those kinds of interventions by the states and recognize their purpose and their effect, which is to disproportionately disenfranchise communities of color, especially Black and Latinx voters in 2020. By the early 20th century, voter suppression rarely proclaims itself to be so in the text of the law. But we, as historians, as researchers, as critical thinkers, can go beyond the face of the law to recognize the ways in which the laws have been and continue to be imposed disproportionately.
I think Ross wanted to actually introduce you, Lori.
Oh, sorry, Ross.
So just so our audience knows, this is Lori Osborne, who is the museum director at the Frances Willard House Museum in Evanston, and is our house museum partner for many years. So it's good to have her face and communicating with our audience. If you have questions, send them in on Facebook and on the Q&A and Zoom, and we'll be able to answer them.
Yeah, we're juggling all these multiple platforms trying to get to the questions. But since we are talking about the Frances Willard House Museum, there's another Frances who plays a real big part in your book. And her story to me is one of the great stories that was surfaced to me. I didn't know a lot about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And I am continually impressed the more I learn about her and her writings. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Frances Harper and her place in this overall story. And because we're talking about her, maybe a little bit about temperance and suffrage and how that looked for the African-American women who were involved in both, and the struggle that they had to really, it's part of Leslie's questions about religion and the role of religion in women's lives and the role of the church and their church, the women's church groups that they belong to. So maybe talk a little bit about her.
Thank you for the opening to talk about her, because she's someone who I deeply admire. So born to a free family in Baltimore, Maryland before the Civil War, an educator, a poet, an anti-slavery lecturer, and by the 1860s, after the Civil War, someone who joins with great enthusiasm in the emerging movement for women's suffrage. Frances Harper is a beacon in what is a really rough and tumble set of politics in the 1860s, where Elizabeth Stanton is calling for educated suffrage, and Frederick Douglass says, no, Black men need the vote, it's life and death. And Frances Harper, with the poet's cadence, says, folks, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And it is one expression of her political philosophy that means that over time she will remain within suffrage work, even as many Black women are discouraged. And she will for many years be an important figure in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, despite I think the awkward, that's probably that's too tame a word, but the awkwardness of what it is to be a Black woman in a movement that itself is struggling with what it means to have a national identity and a Southern identity. So Watkins Harper, I think, is so important for us because she does introduce another theme, if you'll allow me, Lori, and that is in those rough and tumble scenes when old allies are squabbling and more over the 14th and 15th Amendment, whether women and men or Black men, who's going to get the vote. Watkins Harper comes in to talk about the violence and the denigration that Black women are experiencing, not at the polls. She wants to talk about what's happening on streetcars, what's happening on railroads. And this was a dimension of the story that I had known. Sometimes when you work as a historian, like, you know things, but you don't see them. And it's only because Frances Ellen Watkins Harper tells her story about being denigrated, accosted when she travels, that I begin to hear the many other Black women activists who are her peers telling those same stories. And it turns out to be one of the distinct aspects of what Black women bring to the table over the long course of this movement, which is the scourge of sexual violence in their own lives, the scourge of assault and manhandling and more, and transportation. And one of the underlying tensions, I think, in an organization like the WCTU or NASA, is that when Black women are accosted and assaulted when they travel, their white peers witness that and do nothing. And so it led me to think about what it would mean to kind of center these politics less so in what happens in the conventions and the meetings, which are highly orchestrated and governed by rules of order and much more, and centered it right on that train that brings everybody to Chicago for the meeting, and the recognition that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, though she may try and she may buy a ticket so that she can sit with their white compatriots in the WCTU, can't oftentimes, despite having bought the ticket, can't keep her seat in that lady's car, that she will be ejected rudely, violently even, and no one says a thing. Yeah, that's important, I think.
Yeah, the violence that women experience, their bodies on the ground, is really a big theme of the suffrage movement, and it's very hard in some ways for us to connect. The stories of the force feeding is such a dramatic story, and the protests. One of the things I think it helps people to see is that often women's bodies, their very physical existence, is on the line in these, and that's part of the reason they're struggling and they're sticking with it for so long. Yeah, an important part of the story that's kind of, we don't always feel it the same way today.
And I was going to add too, one of the things that I'm perpetually disappointed by in this very troubled coalition of Black and white women activists is that this activism, Seneca Falls, comes out of the anti-slavery movement, which was very explicitly, in its most radical form, which many of these women were participants in that way, not just ending slavery, but ending racism. And I still, when I get to that point where Seneca Falls, there are no Black women, and you do a beautiful job with demonstrating not just were they traveling from other places, there are Black women blocks away from the meeting site. You name them. They know, the organizers know them. They are well known in their community. They're middle class, they're working class, they're everything. And they're not there. And they're not invited. Lucretia Mott, what were you thinking, is what I always want to say. Why didn't you bring a Fortin with you from Philadelphia? And I don't know, of course that split, that starts, and Frederick Douglass is there. Can we talk about that? But then that split just gets wider and wider and wider, of white women refusing to deal with not just issues of race, but Black women who they had been in alliance with, and now they're separating. So I don't know if you got any new, besides racism got worse, or maybe these are slightly different women from the most radical abolitionists. This isn't necessarily the Grimke sisters, but I remain puzzled by that disconnect, I guess.
I think I might be less sure than you are that to be an abolitionist is also to be an anti-racist.
Okay, I know.
Especially when it comes to free Black women. That there is a rift within the American Anti-Slavery Society when it comes to their work with free Black communities more generally. And so I'm not convinced that those two are companions, though they might not be. So that's one piece. I guess the other thing that's important to say about Seneca Falls is that Black women are busy elsewhere. That they, by 1848, have been thinking for quite some time about questions about gender and politics and rights. They have been working in institutions like the AME Church. And so I'm not sure Black women need Seneca Falls. That is to say, I write about how the spring before Seneca Falls is July of 1848. And in May of that year, Black women are organized and turn out in Philadelphia at the General Conference of the AME Church. And they are there, to raise a little heck and to insist that church law be amended to give women the right to have preaching licenses, something Jarena Lee had been calling for decades. So Black women are kind of busy, with their own projects and their own way of approaching shared questions, right? Remember, at Seneca Falls, there is a call for women's power in the church. The women at Seneca Falls, white women at Seneca Falls, also have a grievance when it comes to women's inequality in the church, but they're working it out in a different space. And I think, Leslie, for me, it's not that you can't coexist in some of these spaces, but it's increasingly hard to be a leader. Right, so you know the story of Hester Lane as well as I do, right? A Black woman trying to rise in the ranks in the American Anti-Slavery Society, and there's the glass ceiling is set differently for Hester Lane than it is for white women who aspire to leadership there. And so if Black women want to be active, there are ways to do that. There's ways to do that all throughout the suffrage movement, if you're willing to be subordinate, in essence. I think increasingly Black women take the view that there is no call for them to subordinate or suborn their own strengths. They've earned it. They have the talent and skill. They're being squandered. And they will make that case to white women and to African American men, importantly. But I'm not sure Black women wanted to be at Seneca Falls, at least since there's this sort of void. You know how historians, it's a struggle for us to speak into the void of no evidence, but it's just as likely they didn't want to be there as they did, in my view.
I wasn't sure from reading the chapter, because you just describe all these women who lived there, and I was like, what is she trying to tell me? So I'm glad we have this.
Well, you know, I mean, it's one of those things where the evidence is slim, and you know, and there are folks like historian Judy Wellman who've been working on the history of that, and Nancy Hewitt, who have worked on this history in this region for a long time. But frankly, when I asked them, was there ever a Black woman who exercised any kind of visible leadership in anti-slavery work in Western New York, we're still searching for the first name of the first Black woman, you know.
There isn't a collaboration at all going on.
So yeah.
Well, Martha, do you have some wrap-up thoughts to share with us?
Sure.
Going back maybe to your story of your family, I was so struck with the details of that story, and how wonderful it is that you can trace those stories, and that you can actually work in an office with the photographs of them and know now, if you know, they're so, and I love the idea of connecting to our own voting history and our families. But maybe that's where you can tie up the story, is back with all of them.
Sure. You know, the last story I tell is about my great-grandmother, Fannie Williams, who will go on to be a suffragist and run suffrage school in St. Louis in 1920. But in the 1880s, she's a young teacher. She's just graduated from Kentucky's Berea College, and she's gotten herself a post in Pulaski, Kentucky. And she goes, takes herself to the theater. And enters the theater, and there's a colored section in the theater in Pulaski, even that early in the 1880s. And she decides to sit elsewhere. And for a moment, if you will, gets away with it, but not for long before first an usher and then a constable is called to remove her. There are two things about that story that were very important for me in pushing my thinking in Vanguard. The first is that the way the newspapers recount the story, there's a moment when the constable puts his hand on her. And it comes back to the role of violence, of physical assault, how profoundly exposed African-American women are in ordinary life to not simply the principle of a separate section for Black Americans, right? But the physical hand of white men who feel themselves wholly entitled. So I think that story really brought that home to me. But the second part of it is I didn't know that story. And so, you know, I think that it is a challenge in many kinds of histories, but it certainly is a challenge in African American women's history, as we recognize that we inherit partial stories, and other stories are tucked away. And in my family, that story was tucked away and never spoken of, as deeply admired. She lived a long life till 92. She was deeply loved and admired and known, you know, by my father and the young people of his generation well. But that was not a story we knew. It was not a story we told. And I think there is a way in which there remains a challenge, because when we begin to probe these archives, we're not simply going to find, stories of heroic suffragists. My great-grandmother is arrested, charged, and in the end pays the fine. I think because she's afraid she'll lose her job if she doesn't somehow resolve this, and is advised to do that. That's not a story for a Hollywood film, but I think it is a story about the complexities and the vagaries that women like her, hundreds of them and thousands of them, confronted as they developed their sensibilities about who they were in the world, and they calculated the kinds of risks they would take and when and how they would take them in order to insist upon dignity, insist upon equality. So I feel very fortunate to have found what is an unsettling story, but one that has really meant a great deal to me in shaping my thinking about the women in Vanguard.
Thank you so much, Martha, for this book. As you described with your great-grandmother, there's so many ways that women are active through this book and through this history, and I think we can each find someone or a group of someones to follow and to think about, and to also use to examine our own lives and our own activism. So I appreciate that, and this conversation has been wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to Ross for conclusion.
I do want to thank Martha Jones for joining us today. That was a brilliant conversation. This conversation has been recorded, so if you missed part of it or want to go back and listen more, or write down those great books to read, it'll be available in minutes after we're complete here tonight, and then tomorrow morning on the Hull-House Museum website at hullhousemuseum.org. I want to thank Leslie Harris from Northwestern University and Lily Osborne from Francis Willard House. It is so great to work with such a great team on our series. And if you're looking to find Martha's book, we really encourage folks to support local bookstores here in Chicago. We are partnered with Seminary Co-op Books, and you can find them at samcoop.com and purchase Martha's book there. Or, since we're partnering with so many libraries tonight, go and find Martha's book, The Vanguard, in your local library. The Jane Addams Hull-House Museum Centennial Suffrage Series continues on October 3rd. We'll be screening and discussing the documentary film Surge that followed first-time women candidates that unseated incumbents in 2018, including the historic campaign of Congresswoman Lauren Underwood of Illinois. And then on November 17th at 6 p.m., you can join us for another With You or Not at All conversation focused on the activism and work of Frances Willard, Jane Addams, and Ida B. Wells, and the things that broke their strategic alliances apart and things that put them together, focus on race and women's rights. Thank you again to Martha Jones. Thank you, Leslie Harris. And thank you, Lori Osborne. And thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. And we hope to see you again soon.